Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports. And as promised, here we are with all 202 NBA free agents. That's right. I took the time to review pretty much every single cap table, take a look at all of the available free agents this offseason, and compile them into one video here. That, yes, this video is probably going to be quite lengthy, but we're going to break down every single available free agent this offseason. So if you are new to Utility Sports and you appreciate the amount of work that goes in to a video like this, I hope you leave a like. Subscribe to the channel for more so you don't miss out on other content, and then also turn on the notification bell just so you're notified when we do make an upload here at Utility Sports. So let's jump into a video preview here. And all 202 NBA free agents are sorted by unrestricted free agency status first, because that's probably where a lot of you are most curious and most interested to see. So I figured let's get those out of the way right away. Don't want to make you sit and wait throughout the whole video in case you're just looking for some of those unrestricted free agents. We're going to go in order of the guys who I expect to sign minimum contracts. Then we'll also look at the players who will sign on exceptions, whether that's the biannual exception or the mid-level exception, either the non-taxpayer or the taxpayer variety. Both of them will be included in that portion of the video. We'll also look at cap space and bird rights players, so guys that I think are going to sign for more than that $12.2 million a year mark, which is the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. There's a lot of players out there that I think are going to be warranting richer contracts than that, and those are probably the players that everyone's really interested to see where they go, as well as the players who currently have player options. I included them in this portion. There are players in there that will likely, if they did opt out, potentially sign for the mid-level or maybe even the biannual exception, but a lot of them would likely go for cap space or sign using bird rights with the team that they're currently on already. So I went with those players at the very end of the unrestricted status because it kind of gives us a good comparison based on other players that we've seen before them in some of those other categories that I've categorized across all 30 NBA teams. And then restricted free agency status. So if you're a nerd like me and you really care about, some of the players a little bit later on, like a Grant Williams, Austin Reeves, where they could potentially go, and some of the situations with that, I included some of those normal restricted free agents. But first, we're going to talk about players who are on club options. There's just a little bit over 20 of those players as well. Club options are technically not restricted free agents. They are technically unrestricted, but they have a restricted pathway to getting to unrestricted free agency, where a team has to basically say, no, we don't want you at this price point anymore. So they are somewhat restricted by a team's decision making. Then also we'll conclude the video with two-way players, which is like the biggest nerd out of guys who most of them haven't even made an NBA debut yet. And if they have, they played probably less than 10 to 15 games, a majority of them at least. So we'll talk about those players at the very end. So if you really care like me, you can stick around to the very end of the video and have a lot of fun with that. But without further ado, let's jump into it here with unrestricted free agency status and unrestricted free agents. I'm going to give a quick definition here for those of you who are a little out of the loop with how the CBA works and how free agency as a whole works. Unrestricted free agents, they are players who are completely free to sign with any team using an exception mechanism, which could be that biannual exception, the vets minimum exception, or the mid-level exception to sign with a team, or just flat out through cap space, which there's a lot of cap space out in the NBA this year. In fact, I'm going to make a video later this week highlighting the teams with the most cap space. We'll go through each and every one of the 30 NBA teams. So this video is going to pair very well with that one. That's going to come out a little bit later in the week. This is a really good place to start, though, because then you can maybe have your eyes on some free agents, and then you can see how likely it is your team could potentially sign them later in the week based on money. But then let's start with some of those minimum players, and there's a lot of them, so we're going to fly through it. Aaron Holiday for the Atlanta Hawks. My expectation is he signs with another team on the minimum. Blake Griffin, very possible he does not sign with another team, but I think just with the name brand and he's going to sell some jerseys as a minimum level player, which is more than most guys do. He's a very big name still. Obviously, the play doesn't really stand up to what it used to be, but he is a minimum player coming from the Boston Celtics. The Hornets have two guys who I think possibly sign for minimums this offseason. Svi Mykhailiuk, I'm a little unsure about if he's going to have a landing spot, but typically shoots the ball very well from three, so there's always going to be a market for a guy like him. And then Dennis Smith Jr. Kind of really revitalized his career. Talked about that quite a bit in the Hornets offseason preview. As a Mavericks fan myself, I'm very happy to see that for DSJ, because I think he's a player who deserved another chance in the league. He got it from kind of his hometown Charlotte Hornets, and I'm very happy to see that he's probably revamped and kind of resurrected his career out of nothingness. The Cavaliers have three guys on here: Robin Lopez, Raul Neto, excuse me, and then Danny Green as well. Rolo, Raul Neto, you know, the names explain themselves. Both of them been playing on kind of minimum level deals for a little while now. I think both of them pretty solid additions, can give you nice minutes during the regular season in spot situations where if you have a guy injured. They both give you something. Raul Neto is a pretty good tempo pusher. Robin Lopez, obviously one of the better jump hooks still in the NBA. I don't think a lot of fans know that, but if you're a real diehard, you are definitely aware of Robin Lopez's little push shot that he's got. And then Danny Green, this will be one of the first times he signs for a minimum contract. Typically, he's spent most of his career on mid-level exceptions and kind of those middling contracts, but just with some of the knee injuries he's sustained, with where he's at in his career, he's not going to give a team as much, but of course, he's been around a lot of winning situations, so he still is a valuable pickup on the minimum, and somebody that I think teams will have a lot of interest in, essentially signing to fill into their locker room and also giving them some spot minutes throughout the course of a regular season. Going on to our next batch here, this is the Dallas Mavericks portion of the video, which is really funny because, you know, a lot of blame went to Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving for how the Mavericks season ended. But I think this slide right here, this, you know, graphic's a perfect reason as to why the Mavs season went the way it did, is they really relied on not good players and 5 guys who I think are going to be signing for the minimum next time around this offseason. And Dwight Powell, who was the starting center for the Dallas Mavericks, I would be surprised if he gets anything more than the veteran minimum, maybe, just maybe, the biannual exception. Now I could see Dallas just doing something really stupid and giving him more money than they should, because Dallas doesn't really know what they're doing. And yes, they really love Dwight Powell. They think he's a really nice fit onto their team in terms of, you know, the chemistry, the culture. But I mean, he's just not that good. Honestly, Markieff Morris, they got him in the Kyrie Irving trade. He's a minimum level player at this point. Theo Pinson, I expect him to stay in Dallas. I actually think he's a good embodiment of culture and kind of tone setting for the team. Honestly, sometimes the Mavericks' biggest cheerleader, which I, you know, think that there is some value to that. And he's played decently well in some of the minutes he's gotten, although you have to be pretty careful with how many minutes you're giving him. Frank Ntilikina is just flat out not good at basketball. At the NBA level, that is. Of course, he's better than me at basketball, but he's not a good NBA player. And then Justin Holiday, I think, is just aged out of the league a little bit. He's going to sign for a minimum. Frank Ntilikina maybe sign somewhere. I'm guessing he will, just because he's a former top 10 pick, and typically those guys stick around longer than they should. So Ntilikina probably gets another chance somewhere. I would be surprised if it's in Dallas. Now we go into the Detroit Pistons and Denver Nuggets. The Nuggets have Ish Smith, who I think is actually a really valuable minimum signing. If you guys can't tell, pretty much 1 in every 5 or 6 players that you sign on the minimum are going to end up having a decently positive impact. It's just very inconsistent what you're going to get from these players. Ish Smith, somebody who throughout the regular season, I think, you know, he's been a journeyman. I think that he's actually a pretty solid guard. He's really shined in some of the limited minutes he's found throughout his career in certain places. So I think Ish Smith would be a very nice signing. He's used to kind of moving around and trying to make the most of his opportunity. DeAndre Jordan's just flat out really, really bad at basketball at the NBA level at this point. He should not sign for a contract anywhere. I was shocked last offseason when the Nuggets signed him on day 1 of free agency on the veteran minimum, which is at best, that's what he'll get. And then Thomas Bryant, I included him here in the minimums. I think it's possible too that we might mention him a little bit later on in this video as a guy who could maybe sign for the biannual exception as well, or the taxpayer mid-level. I included him kind of in both sections because I think that there's a chance that he could maybe wiggle his way there. Corey Joseph, Rodney McGruder, and Hamidou Diallo are all guys that to me are minimum players at this point. Now I know Pistons fans are going to push back on Hamidou. I mean, I don't know. He's just not that good. The Pistons won 17 games this year. You can't just keep telling me that everyone on the Detroit Pistons is good, specifically the veterans. I believe in the young core. I don't believe in the other guys. Joseph, McGruder, Diallo, to me, all of them are minimum level players. Then we go on to Golden State Warriors and the Houston Rockets. Golden State here, Andre Iguodala. I put a bunch of asterisks by his name because he's likely retiring. I would be surprised if he's playing in the NBA next season. But if he were to, he would re-sign in Golden State on the minimum. JaMychal Green, really a rough season for him in Golden State. Pretty much solidified him now as a vets minimum type player. I still think he can have a decently positive impact for the contract that he would likely sign. On the minimum, again, 1 out of every 5 or 6 guys is going to have a decent impact. JaMychal Green has the skill set as kind of a stretch big to do some of that a little bit for you. And, you know, just provide some spacing and knock down some shots. But Realistically, just can't rely on it. Ty Jerome, I think, kind of a more sneaky minimum player here. If you're able to sign him, he does some pretty nice stuff with the ball in his hands and as a cutter without the ball. Now, again, is he someone you're going to play a lot down the stretch of a season or down the stretch of games or in the postseason? No, that's why he's a minimum player, but there's still some positives to signing him. Houston, they've got a whole bunch of guys here. Frank Kaminsky, Boban Marjanovic, DJ Augustine, Willie Cauley-Stein. Some of the contracts that were on their book, some of the guys that actually appeared for them a little bit this season, they're all, to me, minimum level players. And I wouldn't be shocked if half of these guys, or maybe 3 out of the 4, don't sign during free agency at all. I think Boban will sign somewhere because, one, he's a very recognizable name, but also notably he's very well liked in locker rooms and has usually been perceived as a good addition when it comes to team chemistry and team morale, those sorts of things. And he also gives you a really big option in the middle when it comes to some offensive post touches in case you're really in a spot where your big man's out. So does Boban really fill any big needs? No, but he's something unique that out in free agency you can't find a lot of guys similar to him, whereas some of these other options, they're kind of a dime a dozen. Then we get into the Indiana Pacers and LA Lakers. George Hill, I expect him to stay in Indiana, kind of in a vet's mentor role, somewhat like Udonis Haslem. We've heard kind of some discussions about how George Hill wants to be that a little bit for Indiana. I think that's a dream come true for the Pacers if that does play out that way. O'Shea Brissett, mostly known for being a good jump shot in NBA 2K. Outside of Indiana, obviously Pacers fans, you guys know him well. I think O'Shea Brissett's actually a pretty decent player on the minimum. He's a nice hustle guy and does some decent stuff off the wing defensively. But at the end of the day, he's still a minimum level player. James Johnson, probably toward the back end of his career. I'd be surprised if he gets more than 2 other contracts moving forward. We might see him sign a one-year minimum somewhere, but I'd be surprised if he gets 2 or more contracts. And then the Lakers, Troy Brown Jr., I know this is probably going to come as a surprise. I still think he's a minimum level player. I know he's had a decent season this year for the Lakers. He's had some nice plays, some nice highlights, but not everybody's going to be able to sign for the mid-level exception or the biannual exception. Yes, there's a lot of cap space out there. It doesn't mean that Troy Brown Jr. gets paid. Tristan Thompson probably is not on the team to start next year, but if he were to sign somewhere, he'd be on the minimum level contract again. You know, there's a lot of players that come in every single year through the NBA draft that kind of phase some of these other guys out. Tristan Thompson's, I think, an example of this at the point of his career. Then we go into the Miami Heat, Milwaukee Bucks. Udonis Haslem, of course, similar to Andre Iguodala. I got the asterisk on there because he's likely going to retire, but if he were to stay, I'm guaranteeing he would sign a minimum with the Miami Heat, but very likely we could see him actually be a coach on the Miami Heat coaching staff next season. Cody Zeller for the Miami Heat was a really nice pickup for Miami. I think that we could see him either stick around with the Heat, which would be very good for them. Otherwise, he could sign for a vets minimum somewhere else. Wes Matthews, I think one of the better vets minimums out here because he's able to shoot with deep range and he's a physical defender. Now, again, you have to be careful with his minutes. There's a reason I view him as a minimum level player at this point, but he still gives you the archetype that you're looking for. Thanasis will sign back in Milwaukee. Goran Dragic, I think, would like to go to Miami. I think that would actually be a really good situation given who Miami potentially could lose in free agency this year. We'll talk about more of their players later on. But Dragic has repeatedly talked about wanting to return to Miami. Then Myers Leonard, very surprised that he got a second opportunity in the league just with how everything was seemingly playing out for him. He likely, if he were to sign, would sign on the minimum again somewhere. I think Milwaukee's a potential landing spot for him just to stay there and continue playing for the Bucks past this season. Then we go into some others here, and Austin Rivers for the Minnesota Timberwolves is really the one I want to highlight on this list. I think Austin Rivers is actually a very, very good vets minimum player because, one, he knows his role. He's kind of moved into a mentorship role there in Minnesota where he's kind of the voice for that team that they need. He's really been a big part of hyping up Anthony Edwards and I think empowering him to continue to be the guy there for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And I think at times this year, Chris Finch underplayed him. I think Austin Rivers, very, very smart defensively. He's a perimeter shot maker who can handle the ball for you a little bit. He's got a phenomenal jab step, specifically out of the corner where he's best. offensively. I think Austin Rivers can still give a team quite a bit throughout the course of a regular season, and even a little bit in some playoff basketball. We saw he was important in Game 4 for Minnesota in a win over the Denver Nuggets. Of course, I'm recording this before Game 5 of that series, so we'll see what happens. But Austin Rivers, to me, is still somebody who can give out buckets every once in a while, which is a huge positive compared to some of the other names on this list. Dario Saric of the Oklahoma City Thunder. I think he'll sign on the minimum somewhere, probably back in Oklahoma City if I had to guess. You know, there's not a lot of players of his archetype still surviving in the NBA. But if there's going to be one that works, I think Saric is one of those players that probably sticks around in the league for another 2-3 years at least. Dwayne Dedmon, I'd be surprised if he signed somewhere, but recognizability as a name typically lends itself to finding a minimum contract somewhere. So Dedmon, he had a very, very tumultuous season with Miami in terms of some of his on-court antics and actions, honestly. Change of scenery to Philadelphia was definitely good for him, but it's not like he's really given the Sixers a lot with his play. Bismack Biyombo, Damian Lee, and Terrence Ross of the Phoenix Suns, all of them are going to sign for vets minimum somewhere. Damian Lee might be a surprising name for some people to see on here. I know he shot the ball well this year, but he's still Damian Lee. Okay. Bismack Biyombo is going to stay in Phoenix. I think Damian Lee will as well. We'll see what happens with T. Ross. Just at this point of his career, though, he's kind of washed. Doesn't really give you the same type of productivity that we are accustomed to seeing with Terrence Ross, which is okay. He's had a very good career for himself. He's been very productive, scored a lot of baskets in his time in the NBA. But as of right now, he's not somebody that you look at as a top 10 player on a good team. It's just really not the way that it's going to be for Terrence Ross, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. We'll see if he can go up there and find a contract for himself on the minimum somewhere, whether that's in Phoenix or with another team. Then we go on to the Portland Trailblazers and Sacramento Kings. 2 Blazers, 4 Kings here on this list. Justice Winslow, who's playing a little bit more expensive than the minimum currently with his last contract he had in Portland. I would just be surprised to see him get something bigger than the minimum. At best, he maybe gets the biannual exception, but I just don't really see it. I don't think that, he had a decent impact this year for Portland, but it just always seems like when you're playing Justice Winslow, the team that has him is like, oh, could we upgrade him to something better? It almost always seems like that's the way that it goes with Winslow. And then Drew Eubanks gave Portland some nice minutes this year, but just the reality of the big man position, if you're not like significantly better than some of the other options, you're probably signing for the minimum. Terrence Davis, Alex Len, both minimum players. Len, I've really loved what he's given Sacramento in the postseason in certain bursts for Sacramento when playing for Mike Brown. Athletically, he still fits in this league, which is why I think he's definitely going to sign somewhere, probably back in Sacramento. Matthew Dellavedova, I was shocked when he signed with the Kings this past year. Didn't really get to see him much on the court this season, but we'll see if Dellavedova sticks around in the league or not. I think Sacramento would be a good option for him to stay. Chimezie Metu, I think, would likely stay in Sacramento as well. For Sac, I think it's about keeping most of their guys and then continuing to look to improve through the draft, and if they can make a couple other trades and maybe one splash signing at some point. That's really the Kings' MO this offseason. So I could see them keeping all 4 guys on the graphic, honestly. Then we go into Spurs, Jazz, Wizards, and for San Antonio, I'm looking at Gorgui Dieng, Keita Bates-Diop. Bates-Diop probably signs back in San Antonio for the minimum. And then Gorgui Dieng, if he were to sign somewhere, would be in San Antonio for the minimum, but it's also possible he maybe takes like a Udonis Haslem approach where he signs on a contract similar to what I think Udonis is going to do and join the coaching staff in some extent. Udoka Azubuike, I remember, he gets drafted out of Kansas and people are excited for him. He's a minimum level player. JTA is as well. Probably both of them could look elsewhere. I think Udoka maybe stays in Utah, but JTA probably looks to go elsewhere in free agency to a team that's, a better team, and maybe even a reunion with the Warriors could make some sense. Kendrick Nunn, Taj Gibson for the Wizards, both of them minimum players. Nunn probably sticks in Washington if I had to guess, but I'm not, convinced or stoked about that. Taj Gibson, I think, should retire, to be honest. Not a shot at him, but that's how I feel. So mid-level exception players, this is where the video gets a lot more fun because these are a lot more impactful guys. Seth Curry, Yuta Watanabe of the Brooklyn Nets. Here in these sections, when you see TP, that means I think they'll sign for the taxpayer. Mid-level exception, which is around $6.5 million. The NT is for non-taxpayer, that is going to be $12.2 million annually. So significant difference between being a taxpayer mid-level guy and a non-taxpayer mid-level guy. Seth Curry, Yuta Watanabe, I think both players, of course. Seth Curry's a very good shooter. Yuta Watanabe was a fantastic corner shooter for a good amount of this season. Really showcased that he can thrive in a role next to stars. If Yuta were to sign somewhere, I think that the Phoenix Suns would be a fantastic landing spot for him. Again, playing alongside Kevin Durant, I think would be a really good outcome just based on the success he found early on this year. He's a very smart rotational defender, and I think he should sign for more than the minimum. Javonte Green, a multi-positional defender, very quick on his feet, very strong, very physical. Both he and Patrick Beverley make their money on the defensive side of the court. Both of them likely signed for the taxpayer mid-level exception this year. Pat Bev was playing on the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. I just think that with where he's currently at in his career, he probably takes a slight step back in terms of financial gain and signs likely for the taxpayer mid-level, but it's still a huge win for him just based on, kind of how he came up into the NBA, his roots to get to where he's been, making $6.5+ million a year, still a very, very good career move for Pat Bev at this point. Karis LeVert, first guy here that I have making non-taxpayer mid-level money for the Cleveland Cavaliers, and I think that he will be re-signed using bird rights into that non-taxpayer mid-level, where the Cavaliers look to keep him around that 3-year 36, maybe 4-year 48 to 50-ish million dollars. Somewhere in that range for LeVert is what makes sense, so that Cleveland has some more flexibility moving forward with the new CBA in terms of making trades and making some adjustments. I would just be surprised if LeVert gets more than 15 million. I would be kind of shocked by that. I think that the non-taxpayer mid-level is kind of the right price point, as is the same for Christian Wood of the Dallas Mavericks. Now, you can notice I don't have Bird written in there for him because he is not going to be playing in Dallas next season. He will definitely be switching teams, so we'll see what team looks to sign him. He's extremely athletic. He's a good offensive talent. I think took a big step forward this year as well with his rim protection and how he played defensively for Dallas. I know, there's going to be the narrative around him that he's not a good defender. Put on the tape, I think for the most part, he was the Mavs' best rim protector this season. I don't even think it was really that close. He's got his flaws for sure. That's why he's not a cap space or bird rights signed player, but I think that whatever team signs him is going to be getting a decent off the bench talent that can help them win some games if it's the right situation. The coach actually trusts him, which for some reason Jason Kidd just never did. Jeff Green, Thomas Bryant, you see I have him listed here again as a biannual exception or taxpayer mid-level, kind of right in that price point that I talked about earlier on, how I could see him signing for the minimum. Last year I was shocked when he signed for the minimum. I think he's a slightly better big than that. Clearly showed when AD missed time this year that he could rebound the ball and give you some really quality minutes as a center. So I think that, defensively he struggles, but still to a team, could he make sense at $4.5 million a year? Yes. Jeff Green, I definitely think is in that same price range where right now he's playing for that biannual exception type of price point. I could see him signing again, either back in Denver or with another team looking to add a veteran wing. And then Reggie Jackson, I have him signing for the taxpayer mid-level as well. Based off his postseason success that he found in LA with the Clippers, a lot of people would have viewed him early on as a non-taxpayer mid-level, but he just really had a disappointing year. So we'll see if some of that history keeps him in this taxpayer price. I considered him as a vets minimum player as well, but ultimately landed on taxpayer just based on name recognition, postseason success, and still what I think he can give a team, which is a quality off the bench guard at this spot of his career. Then we look at some more UFAs that are mid-level exceptions. Torrey Craig of the Phoenix Suns has played himself up from being a veteran minimum player to a taxpayer mid-level this year, again at about $6.5 million. He's had a very good postseason for himself. Mason Plumlee, a big man who I think could maybe fall into either category as a taxpayer mid-level guy if he were to stick with, say, the Clippers or a few other contenders, or if you're looking at a team that has cap space, maybe they pay him around that non-taxpayer mid-level exception price point, which is what he's currently playing on, with the idea that, hey, he could really solidify some backup center minutes for us. He's a very good playmaker for a center, and somebody who, after switching to left-handed free throws, has really improved one of the biggest weaknesses in his game, shooting about 77% from the line since joining the Clippers this year, of course, left-handed. So definitely an improvement for him at one of his big weak spots when you're looking at the scouting report. So Plumlee, I think, definitely played himself into another decent contract. The Lakers have a few guys here. Wenyen Gabriel, maybe a little rich here to see him as a taxpayer guy. Maybe he's a biannual exception guy, but he plays with a lot of heart, plays with a lot of effort. I think for the duration of a regular season, that's a really good addition for a team. Lonnie Walker, I know he lost all of his minutes for the Lakers and he hasn't really seen the court. I still think with the name brand, former first round pick, and some of what he flashed for the Lakers this season when he was on the court, he's probably at least a biannual exception player. Maybe for a team really looking to add some talent, could sign him to a taxpayer mid-level, which is what he's currently playing on at about $6.6 million. So I think he makes some sense there. Dennis Schroeder, what a comeback from a previously big-time fall from grace. I think he signs for a non-taxpayer mid-level exception with a team. He's had a very nice season. At times, he's been the Lakers' best guard. I think he's outperformed D'Angelo Russell since the trades that they've made. Dennis Schroeder's been really, really good for the Lakers, and one of the big parts of their turnaround is just Darvin Ham clearly trusts him, puts him in the game a lot, and rides with him down the stretch of games when he has to. And it's been very successful for the Lakers. Dennis Schroeder's played himself into a good contract, which I'm happy to see him kind of regain some of that money he originally passed on. Kevin Love for the Miami Heat, taxpayer mid-level exception for him. Kevin Love, clearly not the same player he was back in Minnesota or his early days in Cleveland, but there are still things he does very, very well. For example, he takes a lot of charges. Of course, Bucks fans are probably pumping their fists right now as they're hearing that. Obviously, not the biggest fans of Kevin Love with how that series has played out. But Love, I mean, he was second in the league this year in charges, didn't even play that much in Cleveland. So the fact that he was that high in charges drawn this year was very impressive. And also, we all know he can step out, knock down the three-pointer. He's just a pro's pro, specifically at a position that's rather thin. Kind of big man is, if you're looking for skilled big man, Kevin Love's at the top of the list. So if you can get him on a bargain, $6.7 million, that's pretty good to me. Gabe Vincent might sign for the non-taxpayer mid-level, but I kind of prefer him at the taxpayer mid-level. Kind of around that $6.6 million mark like we talked about with K-Love. You know, the Heat have three guys here that I think are going to be important losses for them if they do go to other teams. Of course, there's a lot of guys on this list, so you might be saying, well, not every single team's going to go out and use their mid-level exception. Remember, some of these teams that have cap space might look to add depth, sign these guys for similar price points to what these values are of a taxpayer mid-level or a non-taxpayer mid-level, something along those lines, right? Max Strus of the Miami Heat, again, another guy who at the non-taxpayer mid-level, it's because he can shoot the ball. He's a very good shooter, and that's always valued across the league. Then I have Jay Crowder, Joe Ingles, both of them at the taxpayer mid-level exception. Crowder, to me, yeah, I like both Crowder and Ingles. I think both of them are very good players. If you get them on the taxpayer, that's an absolute steal. And the reason I opted for them being on the taxpayer instead of the non-taxpayer mid-level here is because a lot of the teams that have the non-taxpayer mid-level compared to the taxpayer are just less competitive rosters. So if you're looking for Crowder and Ingles to go to playoff contenders and teams that can maybe make a deep push, you're going to have to see them probably go to a taxpayer team, which is why that taxpayer mid-level exception makes more sense. Javon Carter, maybe a biannual exception player, but he had a pretty nice season for Milwaukee. He's one of the better three-point pull-up shooters in the league, which I know sounds kind of preposterous to say, but if you actually turn the tape, he does a very good job in transition as a pull-up shooter specifically. So Carter, and obviously we know he hounds guys defensively, so I think Carter's played himself into a decently nice contract moving forward. Whether that's in Milwaukee or elsewhere will yet to be seen. Minnesota's got two guys that they're going to lose this year, probably, that would maybe really hurt them going forward. Jalen Noel just had a really tough season for Minnesota, but based on the skill set, I think a team's probably going to sign him to the biannual exception. I think a good example of a player signing similar type of contract to that is Daniel House last year, signing with the Philadelphia 76ers. I think Noel can still be a bench spark plug. Clearly, his adjustment to playing with Rudy Gobert just didn't work out that well. But I still think he's a nice player that could help a team. Naz Reid, I have him as a non-taxpayer mid-level exception guy right now. I think Minnesota would love to keep him using bird rights, and I think it's possible he makes a little bit more than that mid-level exception price at $12.2 million. I could see Naz making up to 16, kind of on the high end, maybe something like a 4-year, $64 million deal. That's pretty spendy. Do you want to sign Naz Reid to that? He has some flaws interior defensively. It's kind of rough. He gets bullied around a little bit and kind of leaves his feet a little too frequently for my liking, but he does give you some really nice stuff, especially offensively. He stepped up big time with Cat out so much this season, and also some of the games Gobert missed. Minnesota would love to keep him, but I think teams like Oklahoma City would be interested. I think that other teams around the league, like the 76ers, would love to get him, but of course their pathway to landing him is a little bit more difficult. So we'll see what the market looks like for Nas, but I think he's going to have a very, very good free agency market ahead of him. Josh Richardson for the New Orleans Pelicans. I have him as a non-taxpayer mid-level. For me, I would stay way away from that. Best I would give him is a taxpayer mid-level. But it just seems like across the league, everybody's higher on Josh Richardson than they should be. So, he'll probably sign for the non-taxpayer, but it's going to be an overpay. Mo Wagner played himself into a taxpayer mid-level exception type of contract this year. I think most likely it's going to be staying in Orlando using bird rights. They won't actually use the real taxpayer mid-level exception to do so, but it's going to be right around that price point, which is really the best way to gauge things when you're talking about player value and what you expect them to sign for. Bang Bang Niang for the 76ers, probably anywhere from that biannual exception to the taxpayer mid-level makes sense for him. Just the three-point shooting at the four-man spot. Yes, he's got weaknesses. He's not very athletic. He kind of looks small for the power forward position. But as a pick and pop player, he's pretty effective there. Shake Milton, Jalen McDaniels, both guys who I look at as, taxpayer mid-level. McDaniels, I could see making a little bit more than that, but it's an interesting situation with Jalen McDaniels because he's had some really bad moments in Philadelphia, but he's also had some really bright ones. So we'll see if he stays or if he goes. We'll see what his market looks like. I think he's a player that it's going to be important for them that they have bird rights on him. TJ Warren, Josh Okogie, two more Suns on this list. I think these guys are just hair better than the others that we talked about earlier on, the Damian Lee, the Bismack Biyombo's of the world. Okogie's had actually a really nice season for him, kind of a revitalization of his career. Looked like his, better days were behind him based on how he kind of finished his tenure in Minnesota. But he had a really nice year for Phoenix and kind of found a lot of success playing for Monty Williams. So for him, I think he signs on the biannual exception, $4.5-ish million. I think is really the right price point for him. And I think he ultimately does stay in Phoenix. TJ Warren for the Phoenix Suns, I think will sign on the taxpayer level. Probably something along the line of 2 years, $13.2 million is what I see for Warren, and I likely expect it to be with the Phoenix Suns moving forward. Then two more mid-level exceptions. These are our last two mid-levels. Trey Lyles of the Sacramento Kings. I see him signing a taxpayer mid-level, maybe a biannual exception price point with the Sacramento Kings. I think that they keep him. He was very, very important for them this year, and he really had probably the best pro season of his career. Then Will Barton, Toronto Raptors. I think he will go to a different team. I don't expect him to stay in Toronto, and I could see him signing from anywhere from $4.5 to $6.5 million. Which maybe is an overpay at this point of his career. I strongly considered him for the vets minimum, but again, the name brand, very recognizable player who's started a lot of games, probably gets him a little bit more money than that, even though contracts should be about what a player is going to give you throughout the duration of that contract, not what he did before. GMs don't always think that way, clearly, with some of the contracts we've seen handed out in the past. So now we get into the cap space and bird rights players. And Kyrie Irving, let's start off with the guy who is going to shake up the league potentially this summer. For him, he's going to sign a full max contract. I'm talking max salary and maybe max years. My guess, if I had to guess for the Mavericks, 3 to 4 years with them on max money. So we're talking a really big contract. I think the Mavericks do keep Kyrie Irving. I don't think that means they're going to be a really, really, really good team. I just think that they're going to have two really good players and a whole bunch of question marks around them, because that's not how you should run a team, but that's how Dallas has been running their team over the last couple of years. And it's just been a disaster each and every time, but they haven't learned from it yet, and maybe they never will. But Kyrie Irving, I think, does stay a Maverick. If he were to leave, he probably signs with either the Phoenix Suns in a sign and trade centered around Chris Paul, or a destination like the Los Angeles Lakers could also make some sense. Then we go on to Russell Westbrook, and I'm really, really happy for us, man. I'm glad that he's having the postseason that he is, because he deserves some love. The amount of hate this guy has gotten from the media has just been outrageous. And I think he's really showcased that, hey, I'm still a really good basketball player, which is what he is. He's a very, very good basketball player. There's a lot of things he does on the court that other players just can't do. Athletically, he's still got it. I think he sticks with the Clippers on not a max contract, but a better contract than a mid-level exception. I think something like 2 years, $40 million, maybe with a player option there, something like that, where the money's not quite as high as it used to be for him. but still a decently rich contract, but one that would be movable for the Clippers in case a trade were to come along of moving off of Westbrook at some point. But for now, I just feel like Westbrook's probably the point guard going into next season for the Clippers. Then we look at Brook Lopez, runner-up in Defensive Player of the Year for the Milwaukee Bucks. He's going to sign for, I think, anywhere from $15 to $17 million. I think really the best price point is 3 years, 48. That's what makes the most sense to me looking at the Bucks cap table. And you might say, well, that's so cheap. How are you going to get it? He's 35 years old. So, you know, in drop coverage, it's not like you're going to age him super hard. He's still someone who's really going to be lengthy and disruptive around the rim defensively, even as he ages, because of his length and size. But, you know, the mobility is shrinking a little bit. He does have his limitations despite finishing second in Defensive Player of the Year. I think we've seen what Duncan Robinson and movement shooting can do to him in dribble handoff specifically. I think that's really been kind of one of the biggest banes of Milwaukee's existence this first round series. So Brook Lopez, you know, based on accolades and voting finishing, you would think, oh, he's going to get a lot more than that. But just given where he's at in his career, his age, and some of the limitations that he does possess, he probably is somebody who signs again a little bit over that mid-level, but not as good of a contract as you would probably think just based on how good of an individual player he actually is. Then we look at the Portland Trailblazers with Jeremy Grant, and this guy's going to get paid. This is going to be one of the biggest mistakes of the offseason. Portland's going to give this guy a lot of money. He doesn't really impact winning as much as he should, but Jeremy Grant is going to be very, very rich after this offseason. And, you know, props to him. Very happy for him individually. But if you're a Portland Trailblazers fan, you got to be hoping that they figure out a sign and trade centered around this guy going somewhere else, because, you know, if you're signing up for 5 years, $200 million of Jeremy Grant, just good luck to you. I can't see it. I don't want to see it. He's not that good of a player, but we'll see what happens. Portland trying to appease Dame might end up hurting their long-term chances of ever being a good team again. Sacramento Kings, Harrison Barnes, a player that they will want to keep. Again, Sacramento, for me, it's all about keeping their own players. Harrison Barnes, probably something along the lines of 3 years, $48 million, similar to what I talked about with Brook Lopez. Maybe a little bit more. I could see him signing 3 years, 51, 3 years, 54, somewhere in that $16 to $18 million range. A little bit of a pay cut from where he currently is, which will help Sacramento keep some money open for a Sabonis extension at some point, which I think is important for them to consider. But Barnes is somebody they're going to want to keep around, and I think they really should. The Bulls, Nikola Vucevic, he's one of the biggest question marks for me this offseason, and I think he's going to look at other teams. We'll see if there's a market out there for him. Notably, he did play in all 82 games. For me, I would stay away from Vucevic, especially signing him using cap space and or using bird rights. If he's making more than $18 million, I think it's a massive uh-oh. But if he's willing to sign for a 4 year, 68 at about $17 million a year, I think that's a fair contract based on what he does give you. But I just think it's really hard to win in the league right now if your center doesn't protect the rim very well. Vucevic does not do that, and he's also aging, and I think we've seen that over the last couple of years from the player that he was in Orlando to how he's performed in Chicago. Vucevic, to me, is a player I would refrain from signing, but I do think ultimately that he does sign a decent contract somewhere, probably closer to 4 years, $80 million. But again, I wouldn't sign him to that myself personally, but I think that the Bulls probably keep him on something similar to that. Then we look at the Toronto Raptors, Jakob Poeltl, and we want to talk about someone who has leverage. Jakob Poeltl has all of it because the Raptors owe their first-round pick next year. Yes, with some protections, but still they owe it to the San Antonio Spurs. And do you think Jakob Poeltl's agent's aware of that and says, oh, interesting, they traded a future asset for our guy, and if they lose him for nothing in free agency, that would be really unfortunate for them, wouldn't it? So Jakob Poeltl's got all the leverage here, in my opinion. Masai Ujiri, I think, backed himself into a little bit of a corner. I know everyone loves to say Masai Ujiri is one of the best GMs in the world. I know he has a very good track record, but sometimes even the best make mistakes. And trading for Jakob Poeltl and giving up as much as he did, I think, going to classify as a mistake unless you're willing to sign him for 4 years, $70 million. And if you are, how good of a team are you going to be? Toronto missed the playoffs this year, of course, made the play-in. That's awesome. Congrats to them, I guess. But I mean, think about it. The Minnesota Timberwolves had a hugely disappointing season, and the Raptors were somehow worse than them. So This Raptors team was bad, to be frank, and they're in a position to lose some other guys we're going to talk about too a little bit later on. So just tough situation for them. And Jakob Poeltl, he's in a spot where he's going to get paid, and I don't know if the Raptors really get better by doing so. The Grizzlies, Dillon Brooks, talk about someone who's lost money. Dillon Brooks has really, I think, cost himself a good amount of money with this postseason where, he poked the bear with LeBron James, and it hasn't panned out very well for Memphis up to this point. And Brooks specifically, I think everyone's starting to catch on that when this guy shoots the ball, it's usually better for the other team than it is for the Grizzlies. So Brooks, to me, I think he's going to sign for around $15 million annually. I think before this playoff run, we probably would have seen him sign for $20+ million somewhere on a team looking to build some type of culture and add some defensive wing versatility, because Brooks is a very good defender. Obviously there's all of these clips where he does get beaten. When you talk all the talk, you're gonna get exposed every once in a while. Brooks is very, very good defensively, but again, with kind of the issues we saw and that have been exposed this postseason, Brooks probably lost himself quite a bit of money, probably in the range of $20 million on his next contract. So goes from probably 4 years $80 million to down to maybe 4 years $60 million with a team, which is a significant change in revenue earning for Dillon Brooks. But still, he's going to sign for a pretty nice contract, and my guess is it's going to be with a different team than the Memphis Grizzlies. Then Kelly Oubre had a career year in terms of scoring the basketball, but the Charlotte Hornets were the 4th worst team in the NBA. So how do you kind of equate those two things? And I think it's pretty obvious. Kelly Oubre, being one of your main scorers, main options, is not good for your team making a deep run in the playoffs. I'm just going to say that. Kelly Oubre probably signs for $15 to $18 million a year. To me, if the Hornets keep him, I'm just kind of out on it. I don't know. Oubre is a solid player. It's not like Oubre is really the problem. The issue is these teams that find themselves in spots where they have to rely on a Kelly Oubre type guy, typically you're going to be bad. So, I don't know. I just, Kelly Oubre, it's hard for me to want to continue talking about this guy in the video, to be honest, because like, I get that he's had a pretty nice season and he's not super inefficient or anything like that. It's just, there's just guys who impact winning more than others, and Kelly Oubre, for me, finds himself on the less impactful side of things. So let's look at player options. There's 21 players that do have player options this offseason. James Harden is really the number one guy to consider, though. And I put him in a Houston Rockets jersey here on purpose because I really think it's possible that James Harden continues a return to Houston, specifically if Philadelphia gets knocked out of the playoffs prematurely. At the time I'm recording this, we've already seen them sweep the Nets, and you think, oh, well, everything's going fine and dandy. Yes, but if they lose to the Celtics in round number 2, I think that opens the door to a potential Harden exit of Philadelphia and a return to Houston, a city that he really loves. He's never ever said anything bad about the city of Houston, even after requesting a trade to Brooklyn initially. I think Harden really loves living in Houston. I think that is a place he wants to be, and he also does like the young talent there. I know that without a doubt that he likes that. So if I had to guess, Harden opts out. He goes to the Houston Rockets this offseason, and we'll see what happens with the Houston Rockets draft pick as well, because perhaps they're playing with some pretty good players there. Draymond Green, the Golden State Warriors, he has a player option as well at about $27 million. We'll see if he opts out of it. I think the Warriors want to have him back, but at the same time, if their playoff run ends in a way that they don't want it to, Draymond Green might get some fingers pointed at him. I think that's one of the more fascinating player options on this list, so we'll see what happens with him. Chris Middleton, the Milwaukee Bucks, I have an asterisk by his name because I think it's possible he opts into it. That contract is very, very rich, and he'd have to opt out of the final year, which is a very expensive year. And I think that year is going to also be very beneficial for him when it comes to rebuilding some of his value and stock and perception of himself around the league by hopefully being healthy next season and just putting together a better year. Talking about health and putting together a good year, Kristaps Porzingis played 65 games for Washington, scored 23 points a game, and defensively all of his metrics were off the charts, specifically with rim protection and kind of dissuading scoring at the rim. I think Porzingis had a very, very good year for himself, and he also thanked Wizards fans on his Instagram with an Instagram story basically saying how much he appreciated, using past tense, his time in Washington and playing for the Wizards. So it almost sounds like Kristaps Porzingis could consider a potential exit of Washington for another team. And with all the cap space out there, maybe Porzingis finds himself on a team looking to take a big step in the right direction. Now, could it be a step that a team regrets and ultimately doesn't impact winning as much as they'd hope? Yes, it's possible, but if he stays healthy, we know the talent's there. Kyle Kuzma is going to get paid. He's going to get paid big time by the Washington Wizards. He definitely opts out of his player option. And the reason why is because it's just a ridiculously low number for how good of a player he is. He will go into free agency, and then I think he will ultimately re-sign with the Washington Wizards on a massive, and I mean massive, contract. It's going to be a big time overpay. The Wizards are in a really tough spot long term, in my opinion, and signing Kyle Kuzma to a big number doesn't really help with that, but I think that's what's going to happen. Then two of the more interesting players this offseason, Fred VanVleet, Gary Trent Jr., two guys that I think are very good players. I just don't think they're going to be playing basketball in Toronto next season. I think Fred VanVleet could potentially go to the Orlando Magic, and Gary Trent Jr., maybe he does stick in Toronto. They do have bird rights on him, but my expectation is that, first of all, he will 100% opt out of his contract because the money value is just not there for him to opt into it. And then secondly, a lot of teams I think are going to be vying for his services. Again, a lot of teams with cap space this offseason. And I think GTJ is going to have a market out there that's pretty strong. I think a lot of teams are going to value his defensive versatility and his ability to kind of disrupt things on the ball and off of it as a player who does get a lot of deflections and also gets a lot of steals on the ball as well. I think he's going to have a very strong market this offseason. Going into players 8 through 14 on this list, Josh Hart of the New York Knicks, he will certainly opt out of his player option, but I think that he will re-sign with the New York Knicks. They love having him there. I'm just looking at the money value-wise. He's going to opt out so that they can work something out in the offseason and get a better contract number for him. Victor Oladipo will certainly opt in after tearing his patellar tendon. I'm hoping for the best for Victor Oladipo. Just the injuries that this guy sustained has been outrageous and just unreal. So hopefully he is able to put it back together through rehab and kind of figure everything out. Jordan Clarkson, really good year for himself. I think a career high scoring year, kind of moving into a starting role. And Utah was pretty solid this year as well before kind of tanking down the stretch of the season. I think JC's found a nice spot for himself in Utah, but I do think he opts out and then probably re-signs a new contract with the Jazz moving forward. Either that or he'll look at some suitors in free agency. THT and Rudy Gay, both of them to me do opt into their contracts. Rudy Gay at about $6.5 million. It's just too good of a contract for him. If he were to opt out, he would sign for the minimum at best somewhere. So for me, I think he's staying in Utah for one more year, and THT at around $11 million. Again, I just think he's staying in Utah at that price point. It's too much money for him to pass up on. Bruce Brown, his player options are around $6.5 million. I think he opts out of it. And Danilo Gallinari will opt in. He tore his ACL, obviously did not play this year, but he'll opt in, trying to kind of solidify that he's going to be a Boston Celtic next season and hopefully play himself back into more future contracts and hopefully a nice role with the Celtics next season. Although we'll see, maybe Sam Hauser has stolen all of those minutes already. Then we look at a few more player options here. Otto Porter Jr. of the Toronto Raptors, Dante DiVincenzo of the Golden State Warriors. Otto Porter Jr., the day I'm actually recording this, opted in to his contract already, which is funny because I was already expecting him to do that because he missed so much time with injury. I already had the asterisk on there. I didn't have to change anything about my graphic here. DiVincenzo likely opts out, but probably looks to sign something a little bit longer term with the Golden State Warriors using early bird rights. Daniil House Jr., Montrezl Harrell, both of them opt in. House playing on the biannual exception. I don't think he gets a better offer anywhere at $4.5 million. Montrez, I think, probably just comfortable playing on the minimum with a opt-in. I just think he doesn't have to worry about moving, and I think he just likes knowing that he has a contract for next year. Derrick Jones Jr., Andre Drummond, both of them for sure opt-in. They're both making more than the minimum. I don't think that they would elsewhere. I'm hoping Andre Drummond, by the way, gets into a good headspace. Obviously talked about some of his mental health difficulties. So Andre, if you're watching this, I'm praying for you. And if you're not, well, let's all, keep Andre Drummond in our minds and in our hearts as well. Just because you have a lot of money and just because you're a pro basketball player doesn't mean you have things that you're not going through as well. So let's keep Drummond in our thoughts and hopefully he gets the help that he feels like he needs and also just gets into a better spot for himself personally. Damian Jones for the Utah Jazz, he'll opt in as well just so that he knows of the security he's going to have going into next season. I just don't think his play this year really warranted another contract, at least a guarantee for another contract. So, having the player option is a guarantee, so he's going to take that. Then the final, or the players here now on the club options, Malik Beasley is really the headliner here for the Los Angeles Lakers. So this is restricted free agency. Again, I have restricted free agency in quotes. The reason for that is because they're technically not restricted. If the team were to not pick up the club option, they would become unrestricted free agents. But again, since there's a club option, I look at these guys as somewhat restricted because they don't really have the choice to become free agents or not. The choice is kind of in the hands of the team. So Beasley, I think the Lakers should keep him. I think they will keep him unless they do something really, really stupid, but I just don't really see that. Derrick Rose, Alec Burks, both decent players, but infamously, both of them are kind of past their prime, and Rose just getting DNP CDs even by Tom Thibodeau, which I thought would be a sentence I never said out loud because Tibbs loves Derrick Rose more than anybody else on the planet, seemingly. But both of these guys are going to be on club options that do not get picked up. Mike Muscala's probably does just because it's a pretty decent price point. Willie Hernan-Gomez for the Pelicans, his will get picked up as well. And then we go into some more here. Herb Jones of the New Orleans Pelicans. I think one of those obvious, that's going to get picked up. This whole slide here, for the most part, except for two players, is pretty much obvious. Yeah, we picked those up. KJ Martin, Isaiah Livers, Lindy Waters. For the most part, these are all young players that their teams want to keep. And they're just really low price points. Kevin Knox, though, Portland Trailblazers, I think that they actually do opt out of that one. The reason why they would move off of it is to try and open up some money for some other deals that they're going to look to make over the offseason. And I think a very aggressive offseason for Portland, trying to figure out how to aggressively win with Damian Lillard. Nathan Knight, I think the Timberwolves keep him for now. Michael Carter-Williams, I think the Magic actually say no on that club option. Only played in 3 games this year for Orlando. He spent quite a bit of time in Orlando in the last 3 seasons or so. But ultimately, I think with Orlando, the situation they're in now, they have so many young players coming in. They have 2 more lottery picks likely this year. So MCW probably looking for a new team. Kessler Edwards, the Kings, I'm sure, are very happy about the fact that they were able to get him from Brooklyn at the price point that they did. I think that they'll keep him. Xavier Tillman starting for the Grizzlies in the postseason with the absences of Brandon Clark and Steven Adams. I think Xavier Tillman is a no-brainer. Hey, we keep this player on our club option for Memphis, no doubt about it. Then looking at some more here, Lamar Stevens of the Cavaliers. I think the Cavs are going to be desperate to keep any wing players that they have, so Stevens is an automatic yes. Miles McBride's an automatic yes. For the Magic here with Goga Bitadze and Admiral Schofield, again, for the same reasons that I said no for Michael Carter-Williams, they don't need to keep these 2 players. Goga just was kind of an experiment down the stretch of the season. Schofield's already 26 years old. They've got 2 lottery picks coming in. I just don't really think that they need to rely on those guys. Najee Marshall's like a no-brainer, yes, please, for the Pelicans, keeping him on his team option. He is really, really, really a solid player, and I think one of the more underrated players around the league. Most people really don't know who Najee Marshall even is, seemingly. Najee Marshall is just very good at basketball. He's a very, very good role player, very good wing player. Defensively, he's always up for the challenge of guarding the best guy if you ask him to. I know Herb Jones gets a lot of the love there in New Orleans, as he should. I'm a big Herb Jones guy myself. But Najee Marshall, you can make an argument that he's just about as good as Herb anyway. Now, I know most people are going to push back on that, but Najee Marshall's had some incredible games in his career so far, and I think he's somebody who's going to have a nice long career ahead of him. Ish Wainwright of the Phoenix Suns, they're definitely going to look to keep him on his team option. The more depth that they can lock in, the better. And then Eugene Amori for the Detroit Pistons, I think could be a yes, could be a no. I don't think he was, disappointing this year at all or anything like that. I just think that with the Pistons, they already have so many young big men that Eugene Amori, do they need to keep him? Probably not, but could they? Yeah, I wouldn't completely rule it out either. So for him, I kind of think it's 50-50 shot on what we see. Then we look at Cam Johnson, and these are just straight up restricted free agents, which is really, really fun. So restricted free agents, what they can do is they go into free agency and other teams can offer them contracts, but the team that they're originally on, so for Cam Johnson's case, the Brooklyn Nets, can elect to match the contract. But with the new CBA, they actually get a 10% kicker now as well. So say Cam Johnson signed for $20 million a year with the team, The Nets would essentially have to pay him $22 million with that 10% bonus representing the $2 million increase from 20 to 22. Hopefully that makes sense the way I explained it. But Cam Johnson's really the cream of the crop here in my eyes. Very, very good three-point shooter, somebody who was super successful early on in Phoenix. I think his adjustment to Brooklyn was a little different. I think kind of showcased why he's not a number 2 player or number 3 guy. He's probably best off being a fourth option for a team. But we've seen him find a lot of success, especially on good teams in his career. So I think he's going to be probably the most coveted player on this list. PJ Washington really came on strong at the end of the year. My guess is both Cam Johnson, PJ Washington stay with their own teams there in Brooklyn and Charlotte. Austin Reeves is really where the conversation gets interesting to me, because he showcased when LeBron James missed time this year that he could be very productive with the ball in his hands, specifically closed out game 1 of the first round against the Memphis Grizzlies as well. So does Reeves get a massive offer from some team with cap space? And I think that's a big question. And then if he does, do the Lakers look to match it? And you would think, well, it's the Lakers. Of course they do. Remember, they let Alex Caruso walk to Chicago a few years ago, and that was surprising to me. They ultimately made a decision between him and THT. Clearly they made the wrong choice. Caruso would have just been much better to keep. And will they make a decision like that with Reeves, where they look at the money, they want to stay away from the tax, or stay low in the tax at least, which is kind of a bus family decision at this point, which I'm not a fan of for the Lakers and for their own team building. But Austin Reeves is a player I think that they have to keep. Both him and Rui Hachimura have been huge in this postseason. I think they would like to keep both of those guys, but the price point for Austin Reeves really might determine some things. Grant Williams, I think, will leave Boston. I think some team's going to give him a contract around $15-ish million, and I think it's just going to be a little steep for the Boston Celtics to match, specifically with that 10% kicker that would, basically opted into a $16.5 million a year type of deal. And for Boston, with already having to lock up Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown's going to be the next contract that they have to focus on. I just think long-term cap picture-wise, it's going to be hard to see them keep Grant Williams, a player who's been kind of in and out of their rotation this year. Kobe White for the Chicago Bulls. I do think the Bulls keep him. There's a lot of rumblings that they've really liked what they saw from Kobe White down the stretch of the season. To me, he doesn't really move the needle that much, but I do think they keep him. Jackson Hayes for the Pelicans. I'm very interested to see how his restricted free agency goes. For me, he's not a player that I'm enamored with, but I do think that the athletic profile, there's going to be teams that have interest in Hayes for sure. Will he stay in New Orleans? My guess is no. They really like what they got from Larry Nance, and I know they like Jonas Valanciunas there as well quite a bit. So I think the Pelicans probably move off of Hayes this summer. I'm just not exactly sure what the price point looks like for him yet in free agency. Going into some more restricted free agents, Matisse Thybulle, one of the more recognizable names on here for the Portland Trailblazers. I expect him to stay in Portland, barring some type of big trade where his rights ultimately get dealt to another team. Nickeil Alexander-Walker for the Timberwolves has played himself into a pretty decent contract. Not a big one by any means, but a decent one given kind of what he had been prior to landing in Minnesota. I thought that was an interesting move for them at the trade deadline, getting Nah in that, and he's really showcased himself as a good versatile perimeter defender who can guard the ball very, very well, and also has hit some timely shots for them both in the play-in games and now in the playoffs as well. Omer Yurtseven for the Miami Heat. We'll see what happens with him. I think he goes to another team just because Miami hasn't really given him the runway to playing that much. So I think Yurtseven would prefer to go to another roster, and I think another team probably takes a shot on Yurtseven, who's had some really nice moments in the past, whether that's in NBA Summer League or in limited minutes at the NBA level. Trey Jones, really solid point guard, probably one of the better players on this actual list, if not the best player on this list outright. Just does not turn over the basketball. San Antonio keeps him, no question about it. I would assume New will stay with the Chicago Bulls as well. They'll match pretty much any offer that I would expect him to get. Paul Reed will stay with the 76ers. I don't think he'll get anything over like $8 million on a contract offer, and I just think the Sixers are going to lock in on him. Delano Banton, I mean, there's a chance that at some point he could be the starting point guard of the Raptors with the way things are going for them. I think he'll stay with Toronto. I would be shocked if something else materialized. Darius Bazley for the Phoenix Suns. He, for me, I mean, I think the Suns are going to be interested in keeping their guys. So Bazley, Landale, probably both stay in Phoenix. I'd be surprised if something else happened. Romeo Langford might not sign somewhere this offseason, to be honest with you. I don't know. I'm kind of out on Langford. He's relatively young, former first-round pick, so I could see him sticking around somewhere just because that's the way these things tend to play out a little bit. But Langford really hasn't inspired me into buying any of his stock up to this point. Then looking at some more restricted free agents, David Duke Jr. was actually one of the better players in the G League this year for the Long Island Nets. I think the Brooklyn Nets are going to keep him around. There's a lot of questions right now around Brooklyn about how they're going to go about roster building. I think there's going to be a lot of movement this offseason for the Brooklyn Nets. So if you're a Nets fan, you're going to be excited because your team's going to be in the news quite a bit. And this time it's not going to be about Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant drama. It's going to be about team building and making some roster changes, which is always a little bit more fun than hearing how your point guard doesn't like your owner. I mean, that's just not fun stuff to be in the news about. But I do think Duke Jr. is going to be a pretty nice player long term, as long as the Nets continue to focus his development. Luka Garza, I think, has found a home with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Pretty nice spot minutes this year. Again, you talked about Naz Reid filling some of those spot minutes when Gobert and Towns were out. Luka Garza stepped up big time as well. Former Big Ten Player of the Year, former Wooden Award winner in college. Luka Garza is just a flat-out good basketball player, and I think the Timberwolves like having him off the bench. Anthony Lamb really found a home in Golden State. You know, some of the assault stuff that got brought up earlier in the year has been swept under the rug a little bit. I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen a little bit more Anthony Lamb in the postseason. In fact, we haven't really seen him at all. But Golden State, they're going to keep him. They want him on their team. He's a good player to have for 82 games. Saban Lee for the Phoenix Suns. I mean, I don't know. I could see him staying. I could see him going. And then Trevor Keels for the New York Knicks, a two-way guy, a player that the Knicks, I think, would like to keep. They just drafted him last year. So Keels, I'm sure, will be on the team. And let's go ahead and look at some more two-way players here now in just a second. All right, looking at some of those two-way guys now, we see Lester Quinones of the Golden State Warriors had a really nice year for the Santa Cruz Warriors in the G League this past season. We'll see what happens with him. I mean, these two-way guys are kind of hard to predict what actually happens and where they stick. But I do think the Warriors probably do keep Quinones on their at least short list of guys they'd like to have around. Fiondu Kabengele, of course, kind of played himself into that two-way contract with the Celtics during the Summer League last year in Vegas. Had some very awesome moments playing in the Summer League, and Boston ended up rewarding him with a two-way contract. I think he probably sticks with the Celtics long-term in that kind of role as like a two-way player that they want to continue to have close to the organization, because as a skill set perspective, can step out, shoot the three ball pretty well for his size, rebounds the ball decently well. So if you're looking for long-term Al Horford replacements, not that Kabengele is going to be good at it, and he's not going to be a great addition, but he's going to be able to give you some of the similar play style at least. And you hope that, you know, on any given night, maybe he can knock down 2 or 3 three-pointers. Jared Butler, former first-round pick of the Utah Jazz, did not stick with Utah, though, and has found himself now to Oklahoma City's two-way roster spot. You know, for him, he's going to probably bounce around again. Oklahoma City has so many guards already that I just don't really see a spot for him ever breaking into that team. AJ Green did play some serious minutes this year for the Milwaukee Bucks, and I think they're going to need him with all of the players we've already talked about, potentially leaving in free agency, a guy like Joe Ingles, Wes Matthews, Jay Crowder. I think AJ Green's three-point shooting capabilities are going to be valued there by Milwaukee, and he's probably going to find an actual roster spot on the team, specifically after they move Jordan Moore at the deadline this year. Trevor Hudgens, I mean, I think that Houston probably renounces his rights. Scottie Pippen Jr., I think the Lakers will keep him as a two-way guy moving forward. Xavier Moon for the Clippers, 28 years old. Like, he's a good G League guy. I just don't think he ever progresses above that, unfortunately. Colin Gillespie, of course, very accomplished collegiate player. Denver Nuggets, I think that they actually do keep him around, and that at some point he could maybe grow into finding a roster spot there in Denver, just given the situation that's unfolding with Ish Smith, maybe potentially leaving in free agency, could open up a point guard spot on the roster. Julian Champagnie, a very good forward, one of the better players on this two-way list. I think that he will ultimately find a roster spot at some point this offseason, albeit maybe not with the Spurs. I do think he does land somewhere, though. Mac McClung probably does not land on an NBA roster, but he's obviously former dunk champion, so he's going to be one of the more notable names. Team probably gives him a camp tryout to see if they can sell some jerseys of his. Louis King played one game this year and scored 20 points. Louis King's a bucket. He was one of the best players in the G League this past season. Philadelphia always does a pretty good job finding some G League guys. Specifically, Daryl Morey's teams always do a pretty good job with G League guys. So, they find accomplished players, and I think Louis King's a guy who does find an NBA contract at some point, maybe if it's not this year, though. John Butler, a guy I really, really like. I liked him last year out of Florida State. He will find an NBA roster spot down the road. Now, I think he needs a couple more years of G League development, but maybe when he's 22, 23 years old and kind of grows into his body a little bit more, gets a little bit stronger, we'll see that guy find an actual spot. Matt Ryan for the Timberwolves. We saw him hit a game winner this year for the Lakers. We saw him play quite a bit for the Timberwolves. He'll stay in a two-way role, and a team's going to call him up every once in a while when they feel like they need some shooting. J.D. Davison, of course, one of the fun names from last year's draft for the Boston Celtics, probably stays as a two-way player going into next season. Same with Justin Lewis. I just don't think that there's anything more for him out there than that as of right now. Ron Harper Jr. is a guy who I do think will be on an NBA team next season. I really liked Ron Harper Jr. in the draft. Now, I know athletically his profile is rather limiting. He's not very quick on his feet, but defensively, all the technique stuff is there that you're looking for to be a solid perimeter defender. I think Ron Harper Jr. would be a really sneaky pickup for a team, or just a solid upgrade for Toronto to include him into their roster long term. Jeff Doughton, don't really see anything for him in terms of long term stepping up into a role. Same with Darius Days or Jack White. Olivier Sarr is a really solid rim protector. I think actually Oklahoma City could have used him a little bit this year. Summer League, he was one of the best shot blockers around. Orlando Robinson for Miami, he's already played quite a few NBA games. We know he's an NBA level player. It's just about getting a little bit older, a little bit more mature, and just getting a little bit more consistency as a defensive option for Miami. I think he'll be on the Heat actual roster next year. Nehemiah Queta, I think, will be a Sacramento King next year on their actual physical NBA roster. Now, he'll probably ride the bench most often, but he had a very, very good season for the Stockton Kings, and I'd be surprised to see him go anywhere else in free agency. Keon Ellis will probably be in the G League again next year on a two-way deal. Maybe not with Sacramento, but probably a two-way player. Same with Jamal Cain, Mamade Diakite. Yeah, a lot of these guys here going down the list. Buddy Boeheim, you look at him as a shooter. That's really all he's going to give you. He's pretty big for his position, but I don't know. He just doesn't really move the needle that much for me. A lot of these guys are G Leaguers. I think Isaiah Mobley could turn into an NBA player at some point. He's got good touch as a big man at about 6'9". So anytime you find a bigger guy who can shoot, you think about like the JaMychal Greens of the world. They don't have to be the most athletic, most skilled players, but if they can knock down a three-point shot, they already become very interesting to a lot of NBA teams just because they offer length, size, and shooting, which Isaiah Mobley offers all of those things. Terry Taylor, we've seen him in the NBA quite a while. With the Pacers specifically, I think he's better off as a G League guy. He was doing so with the Windy City Bulls this year. Drew Smith, Johnny Juzang, Trent Forrest, Teo Maladone. Out of all those guys, Juzang's the one who has the best chance of breaking into the NBA and sticking a little bit. He did a little bit for the Jazz this year, recorded his first basket in the NBA, but I just don't think that there's a lot here between these guys in terms of consistent minutes in the NBA. McKinley Wright played quite a bit for the Mavericks down the stretch of the year. He's at best a two-way player. Don't see anything more than that for him. Gabe York can really play. He can really, really shoot. I think he should be a player that does find some minutes in the NBA level at some time or at some point in his career. Dwayne Washington, I think, is a good NBA player. We saw him for the Phoenix Suns. I was kind of surprised when the Suns cut him last year because he had given them some nice minutes. They opted for Saban Lee over Dwayne Washington. I think that was a mistake, but that's ultimately the decision they made. Dominic Barlow, he'll be a Spur next year, just outright on their roster. Moussa Diabate had a very intriguing year for the Agua Caliente Clippers. Probably be in the G League next year, though. Jay Huff actually did get the call up to the NBA this year with the Wizards. He's a nice player, pretty skilled big man. I just don't know if the athletic traits are fully there for him to stay on the court. And then the last one we're going to talk about here, Kendall Brown, actually from Apple Valley, Minnesota. He's a good player, played for Baylor in college last year. We talked about him a lot in the channel. I think he's going to get more minutes next season for Indiana. I think that he needed to grow a lot in terms of his physical profile, athletic traits were there, but I just think the muscle mass was not there yet. I think he needed to improve as a shooter, and I think he just needed more reps so the game would slow down around him. Hopefully we've seen that transition for him. So I hope Kendall Brown can kind of break in and get some more NBA run next year. But if not, he'll be in the G League and still working toward that goal, which at some point I think he ultimately will find some success and get to a spot where we do see him play some NBA minutes somewhat consistently. Thank you everyone so much for watching. I really hope you did enjoy today's video. I had a lot of fun talking about all 202 NBA free agents this offseason. If you have any questions about potential landing spots for some of them, let me know what you think down in the comment section. I'd love to answer some of your questions. And it was just a lot of fun recording this video in general. Again, I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.